Once again, Ryan Grimm, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me here, RJ.
So let's start with this, something that you wrote about and I wrote about as well, because it just seemed so extreme. And that is the case of Rashida Tlaib being falsely accused of by no less than Jake Tapper and Dana Bash of CNN of anti-Semitism. And my short version would be, you tell me if you think I've left anything out. I did write about it. Is that Rashida was interviewed for a local Detroit newspaper, a little bit of awkward phrasing in the way it was written up, which I wouldn't have taken to mean she alluded to someone's Jewish identity, but I suppose being generous, you could see it that way. She then is accused by Dana Nessel, the person she's criticizing, the Attorney General of Michigan, as using, quote unquote, using her Jewish faith to attack her, when what Dana Nessel did was, in my view, unreasonably prosecute protesting students protesting about Palestine. And even after the reporter who conducted the interview debunked it twice, Bash and Tapper continued to push this until finally they had to offer anemic apologies. Is that, from your point of view, a fair summary?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, or a couple things I'd add, there was a week between the interview that was published in the Detroit News and Dana Nessel complaining about it publicly. What happened in that week is that the day Nessel complained publicly was the day that Rashida Tlaib got hit with a genuinely, like, unquestionably racist cartoon in the National Review, where she was depicted as holding like a Hezbollah pager that exploded in her, like, on her desk. And so, just as people were starting to denounce this cartoon and say, that this is, a ridiculous example of the way that Rashida Tlaib is treated differently and with contempt, Nessel jumps in and says, just like Rashida Tlaib should not be attacked for her religion, Rashida Tlaib should not attack me over my religion. So whether it was her goal or not, it very effectively worked to suppress any sympathy that Tlaib was going to get for this blatant attack that came at her, and instead focused the attention on this fabricated claim that Tlaib had come after her for her religion. The final point I'd add of context for people that didn't get into the weeds on it, in the article, in her interview, she said that Nessel's office was biased, and she gave two reasons for that. One, there were all of these other protests against all of these other things, which were more violent than the campus protests were, yet Nessel did not bring felony charges on any of those protesters. So she was just saying, as an outcome, the bias is clear. She also said that there was pressure from President Ono and the Board of Regents, the University of Michigan Board of Regents. She said the bias must be coming from somewhere. The pressure was coming from somewhere. And she said it was coming from the University of Michigan regents that really wanted to crack down hard. And she said, quote, Nessel fell for it. So if she had not said that, you could imagine a world where you can give some sympathy to saying, okay, well, she's saying she's biased, but she's not explaining why there's bias. And if she didn't explain that there's a biased outcome, like there's an actual different outcome, you could imagine a world where critics of her would say, okay, there's room for interpretation here. But she
Right.
did specify why she was saying what she was saying, and it was under pressure from the University of Michigan that created this biased outcome. And even after it was pointed out to Dana Bash, Jake Tapper, and others, and ADL, for instance, that they had completely slandered her, libeled her, they said, well, we reached out to her for clarity about what she was talking about. It's like, you don't have to reach out for her for clarity. She said it. You just have to scroll down to the bottom of the article and you can find it for yourself.
Right, right. And you can read the tweets that if you're Jake Tapper that were directed at you, or
Right.
whatever the proper terminology is, uh, that corrected you. And my take on that one, and I want to segue from that to another one pretty quickly, but a couple other to add to your addition. Uh, what Dana Nessel did was the classic feint, or at least alluding to the classic feint of equating criticism of Israel and Israel's actions with anti-Semitism. Because there's no question that Rashida Tlaib has made it clear she's critical of Israel. In this case, she was pointing out that people who are also critical of Israel's actions in Palestine get treated differently by college administrators and by media, as we now know. So my take on it was to focus not on Nessel, but on Tapper and Bash, two of the best known journalists really in the country,
Right.
and compare them against the code of ethics of the Society of Professional Journalists. And from and I know reading the code of ethics of journalism to a working journalist is like reminding a Chicago cop that it says "protect and serve" on his door. They may not, it's not going to necessarily hold a lot of weight, but it's there. And
Yeah.
from beginning to end, they broke rule after rule, including, making sure they had as close to a primary source as they did. Well, they didn't. They actually went third hand. What Dana
Yep.
Nessel says, the Detroit News reporter says Rashida said,
Right.
right? And they couldn't confirm it.
Hmm.
And so they just went with it because it met their biases. Something else the Code of Ethics tells them not to do is feed to your biases. Something else the Code of Ethics tells them not to do is believe information just because it comes from what you consider in-group sources,
Hmm.
insiders, and criticizes. I mean, we could go down the whole list. We don't have time, but
Yep.
it was an extremely unprofessional display on their part, I thought. What about you?
Yeah. And I think they both recognized it, but weren't willing to kind of take the steps to correct it. But both, Tapper later said that he misspoke, but then
Right.
he asked, I think he was Nessel, what did you think about it? And Dana Bash said that she wanted to issue a clarification, but then she didn't clarify, and she only kind of dug deeper into it. So I think they both did recognize the problem, but then they fell back on this other internet truism, or not truism, but internet line, where when you get caught accidentally spreading misinformation, like something that's completely wrong, a hoax, you then say, well, what's really interesting is that I believed it, and that means something. Like, no, that actually doesn't mean anything. Like, you believed something that was untrue. There's no deeper meaning there, and any attempt to derive deeper meaning from that is just a way to kind of excuse the mistake. And it's hard to just say, look, we made a mistake, um, and we didn't read the full story. Our producers didn't read the full story. We didn't get comment, and we went with something. We just went with Dana Nessel's claim, like you said, about a thing, when actually what was so remarkable at this situation is it was not something that was unknowable, where there's where we all would love to get to the bottom of this, but it's just impossible to know. No, it's
Right.
like right there in the article. It's maybe there was a paywall, but I think CNN can afford the
Yeah, CNN can
you know
step up, or I could show them a trick or two if they need
yeah.
help. But
Yes.
I'm going to go back to the code of ethics, Ryan. Here it says that journalists are expected to acknowledge mistakes and correct them promptly and prominently, explaining corrections and clarifications carefully and clearly. Let's see if Tapper and Bash did that. My recollection is that it took them days, especially
Mhm.
Tapper, to respond. And as you said, Tapper just said he misspoke, which is a kind of, who is Reagan's press secretary, Ziegler, or Nixon's press secretary, Ron Ziegler or somebody, mistakes were made, kind of.
Right.
He didn't misspeak. It wasn't, misspeak is when I call you Raymond instead of Ryan. That's a misspeak. He said false things. And as for Bash, she said, I want to clarify, not correct, clarify, Tlaib did not reference Jewish identity. I'm quoting Bash, and, quote, her office says that's not what she meant. Okay, we know that trick. Okay,
right. She didn't say it, and she
when the
didn't mean
teacher
it.
says, well, Ryan says he didn't mean to hurt your feelings, and so we have to, come on, we know what she's saying.
Right.
And then she does the tapper move. She said, Nessel, who she did feel obliged to go to for another quote, said, quote, she says she still believes Tlaib's statement is anti-Semitic. So she left it with a repetition of the canard. And I just want to run something else by you because I think it's relevant to this and anything else we discussed today. And that's the Code of Ethics says that journalists must, and I quote, support the open and civil exchange of views, even views they find repugnant, end quote. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that Dana Bash and Jake Tapper have strong views on Israel-Palestine, I suspect, and that they differ strongly from Rashida Tlaib's. But they're obliged to air both points of view, Nessel's and Tlaib's, fairly and without slurs or accusations. But they left the slur lingering in the air. And I think that to that I'll only add the closing line of this section, which is, quote, journalists should examine the ways their values and experiences may shape their reporting. And let me interrupt here to say, I've seen Dana Bash as a paid host of Pete Peterson's fiscal summits calling for Social Security spending cuts for years, I assume paid or encouraged in one way or another. And it continues to say, quote, ethical journalism means taking responsibility for one's work and explaining one's decision to the public, end quote. If this were a test, I would not give them a passing grade. What about you?
I would actually be surprised if she was paid for that. But it is interesting that she was willing, if she wasn't, that she was willing to do it. Pete Peterson, spent $500 million of his own money creating an entire infrastructure in Washington, D.C. to push for spending cuts in Washington, which is just squarely in the contest between all the different sides within Washington. And, if you're going to try to cover that fairly, it really puts you on one side to be doing that. But it also, I think, shows that deficit cutting is just the kind of oxygen in Washington. And right. I bet that she didn't even see it as a partisan or a contestable question where she was putting herself on one side against another side, because she's like, oh, these Democrats support deficit reduction, these Republicans support deficit reduction. Bill Clinton's here, George Bush is here,
right?
We're all friends. Everybody agrees. It's almost like back in the days when it wasn't controversial to say you supported clean air and clean water, or right. You're against littering. Like everybody's against littering. This is just a public service announcement. The deficit is just obviously bad. It's public service. We're not even getting involved in politics here. But it shows you, it does show you kind of what the water is like in Washington, what things are just accepted as fact and which aren't. And the CBS News morning interview with Ta-Nehisi Coates by Tony Dukopil or Tony D, whoever you say his name, was also revealing. Like you could not imagine. So what he was challenging Coates, he was saying, look, you showed, the system of discrimination.
Just a quick background.
Yeah.
For people who don't know, Tony Dukopil, I'm not sure the pronunciation, was interviewing Ta-Nehisi Coates about Coates' new book, which is entitled The Message, where he visits three foreign countries with racial issues, and one of them is Palestine. He writes strongly about it. He steps outside, well outside the Beltway consensus on that. And I just wanted to point out for people who didn't know that that was the source of the grilling that he was receiving from CBS Morning News, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so Tony's argument was, why didn't you? Okay, you did lay out the problems with the discrimination in Hebron and elsewhere in the West Bank. He's certainly not going to call it apartheid. He said, but why didn't you contextualize it and talk about the cafe bombings and the things that the Palestinians did? He doesn't quite complete the sentence because the sentence has to be, to deserve the system that they're living under. And Coates very cogently and forcefully just says, look, either apartheid's right or wrong. That's it. Like, this is not about the hyper morality of the Palestinians. But you could never imagine a world in which the reverse was said on CBS News, which is that there was a reporting about, say, a suicide bombing that killed civilians, and you had an anchor say, well, hold on a second. Okay, yes, it's true that that happened and that's bad, but what about the context? What happened to that family's land? What happened to that family's relatives in the last decades? What were the reasons that this suicide bomb was carried out? You cannot imagine that world. You can never imagine that level of contextualization being offered. But when the reverse is the case, and Palestinian civilians are being killed, or Palestinian civilians are living under apartheid, Tony Ducapel requires that you explain why that objectively bad thing is actually justified. And it's another example of the way that the imbalance reveals itself.
I think that's right, and I think it's critically important because we have a media universe where what happens is that the person who speaks on one side is uninterrupted. The person who speaks on the other side is expected to answer, not just with context, but with a very slanted form of context. Tony Ducapel didn't say, why not deal with the fact that Israel deals with terror groups that want to eliminate it and has also taken a lot of people's land away from them and is using, it wasn't a one-sided. I was especially shocked that one of CBS's questions in that is, to me, this is the worst exchange, Ryan. Ta-Nehisi Coates says, I'm working with the person that's guiding me, a Palestinian whose father, grandfather, grandmother were born in this town, and I have more freedom to walk than he does. He can't ride on certain roads. He can't get water in the same way Israeli citizens who live less than a mile away from him can, end quote. CBS's answer through Ducapel. And why is that? Why is there no agency in this book for the Palestinians? That, if you think about it for even a second, is a profoundly disturbing thing to say. It's like saying, why is there no agency for the people who were enslaved for 400 years? Why was there no agency for the children who died in a bombing anywhere in the world? The notion of agency on the part of the victim, to me, is equivalent to, or in the parking space next to, basically saying, well, why don't they fix it themselves? Or even maybe, what did they do to have it coming?
Right.
Am I being too extreme?
No, I don't think so. Because I think, and if you go back to the suicide bombing question, like, I'm against suicide bombings, period. And it doesn't matter, what you say to me about what happened to the the family or the person. Like I'm against those. Like it's wrong to attack civilians. Like period. And so it cuts both ways. But I think it's so much easier for Americans to understand it from one direction, but not the other. Coates had I thought, a good analogy for anybody whose mind was open enough to hear it. He said, "I'm against the death penalty." And so I'm against the death penalty for somebody who sold a nickel bag of weed or a serial killer. Like what they did does not matter. I'm just simply against the death penalty. And he's against apartheid. So it doesn't matter what you can point to throughout the years. It's just
Right.
it's right or wrong.
And it's all equally reasonable to say I'm against punishing anyone for something another person did.
Yes,
It's
that's
absurd.
fundamental. Sins of
Yeah,
the father.
yeah.
It's like
I mean, you know me, radical loudmouth. I mean, I keep telling people Americans are the last people on earth who should be encouraging
yes, collective
the punishment of
responsibility.
individual
Yes.
citizens based on the actions of their government. That's not a road
Yeah.
we want to go down.
No, no, definitely is not.
Um, so I guess both of these, and by the way, I would also flip the conversation about CBS Morning News and what happened to Ta-Nehisi Coates. I would also flip that over to the code of ethics, excuse me, in the sense that here too, I think what's happened a lot in the coverage of Israel and Palestine is a lack of challenging one's own assumptions, as the code of ethics encourages people to do. But one kick that I got out of this, Ryan, and I'd love your thoughts about, is with Bash and Tapper, and I think with CBS Morning News too. I pulled one of CNN's own articles about misinformation. We hear a lot about misinformation, disinformation, and how we have to stop it. And usually that means getting fringe elements silenced and maybe not so fringe. But what the CNN article did was covered the American Psychological Association's misinformation research, including what psychological factors make people more susceptible to deception. That's their quote. They include the emotional content of misinformation. Quote, people are more likely to believe false statements that appeal to emotions such as fear and outrage. I would argue that's Tapper, Bash, and Tony on CBS Morning News. And they say, quote, people are more likely to believe misinformation if it comes from in-group sources rather than out-group ones. Here too, I think people might be more inclined to believe government officials and so on. And so to me, part of the challenge that people like you and I face, Dropsite News faces, and so on, is we've got to challenge. It's almost we have to challenge the misinformation, but we have to meta challenge, or the framework and the culture out of which the misinformation comes. And I don't know if you have any thoughts about how to do that, but if you do, I'd love to hear them.
Well, one thing that's helping to break through is it looks like Ta-Nehisi Coates' book is doing quite well. And the interview he did with Tony D over at CBS News, I think now has 30 million views just on Twitter
Really?
alone. Yeah,
Okay.
I just looked it up. TNC's book is #1 on Amazon. You know, #1 in I like when how they do categories.
Uh,
It's #1 in books. The category is books.
wow. Oh,
So
okay.
so TNC's beating the Bible. And I think that the attacks on him have probably only helped the sales of the book. So and also his eloquent and calm rebuttals of them, I think, helped as well. Um, but millions of people are going to read this book, and he has a way of opening people's eyes to seeing the world in a way that they hadn't seen it before. He did that for a lot of liberals with race and racism, um, and he's going to do the same thing. Now, a lot of people are going to hate him for using the same frame and skills that he had, that he used 10 years ago. Uh, but many others are going to read it with an open mind, and I think he could have a genuinely, make a real dent in the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, more power to him. I have an innate sort of skepticism when somebody becomes too much of a celebrity. And even though he's done brought great things into the public conversation and reparations and so on, at a point I started thinking, well, his celebrity has made him almost a palliative. White liberals can assuage their guilt by
Hmm.
saying, hey, I read a Ta-Nehisi Coates book. I can't be
Right.
all bad. But here's a guy, a person with a lot to lose also.
Hmm.
I mean, he's an extraordinarily successful writer, but being an extraordinarily successul writer is not like being a tech billionaire. I mean,
Right. Yes.
so he's probably quite well off, but he can lose something, and it can hurt,
Hmm. He put a lot on the
including his
line. Yep.
reputation, his popularity. It takes genuine guts to do what he does. And now I look at the trajectory of his public career and think, well, it was all, what did Martin Luther King say? The moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. It was bending
Mhm.
towards a good outcome. And I guess in conclusion, for the rest of us who are not, at least as of this writing, number one in books on Amazon, uh, uh, what can we do? I know, I tried to speak out on Tapper Bash, and now we have CBS Morning News, which I think we're both going to talk about. What else? Just keep on keeping on, or is there another trick to it all?
Yeah, I think keep on and speak honestly, write honestly. Uh, Coates deserves a lot of credit for that. He built up a lot of capital with liberal
Mhm.
America, and instead of husbanding it and kind of transforming that capital into um, just fame and wealth, he's spending that capital
Right.
um, in a way that feels deeply moral.
Well, I promise you, if I ever get any of that capital, I'll spend it too, I guess. But it's a great point, and I really appreciate him for it, and I appreciate you for all the great work in this area too.
Oh, appreciate you too, RJ.
On that kindly note, anything to add, or you think we pretty much covered it?
That's it. And we can put we did petitions both to CNN and to CBS News, telling them to get right on this. And for CBS News, we did a petition telling CBS to send Tony over to Hebron. Like if he really believes that this is something that can be justified by context and rationalized by history, then let people see it firsthand and explain to them the context, and let viewers decide if they feel like that the ends justify the means here.
It's such a great ask, and I'll make sure when this interview goes up, among other things, that the links to that will be available so that people can put in their support for this idea, because we're not asking for slanted treatment. We're just
Right.
asking for a camera and Tony and a crew to the paths, walk the paths that the people of Palestine walk every day, and then come back and tell us,
Yep.
and play that footage for us, and let us all decide for ourselves. So,
Yep. Yeah, it's all we can ask.
all right. So, Ryan, people can find you at
Yeah.
Drop.
Dropsitenews.com.
All right.
Yeah.
And again, Ryan Grimm, reporter, author. Thanks as always for your great work, and thanks for coming on the program.
You got it.
We depend on your support here at the Zero Hour, so please give whatever you can at any of the links you see on your screen. Thanks so much.